The city didn't care that she was losing everything. Rain fell as if mourning with her, tracing silent tears down the glass wall of her world. But it was behind that glass, behind a cold, steel doorway, a man with ice in his heart would give her the offer that would either destroy her or save her. Asterisk, the morning sky hung low over Seattle, painted in mournful gray. Rain fell in quiet, steady lines, misting everything it touched, cars, buildings, even the fragile hopes of a girl named Alara Monroe, 22 years old, and already older than her age. Alara stood outside the steel and glass monolith of Hawthorne. Capito, she looked like a ghost against the marble lobby, soaked from the storm, trembling in a thin second-hand coat. In her hands, a file, inside it a foreclosure notice. The last reminder of a life once filled with love and safety. The house wasn't just a building, it was the only memory left of her mother's laughter, her father's storytelling, and the brother she'd lost too soon. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was just 11. Her younger brother, Aidan, had passed the following winter from pneumonia. Since then, the house had become her sanctuary and her prison. She'd been raised by her aunt, who passed away just months ago. Now, Hawthorne Capital, a ruthless investment firm, owned the debt on that house, and they weren't interested in mercy. She had tried everything: emails, legal aid, phone calls, in-person appeals, all met with silence, until she received an official letter. It was curt but unexpected. Meeting approved. Julian Hawthorne, 9:30 a.m. Julian Hawthorne, CEO of the empire, infamous, unreachable, unyielding, a billionaire who had never been known for kindness. Some called him brilliant, others called him broken, a man with everything except a soul. Alara stepped through the glass, doors into marble and chrome. Her boots squeaked against the polished floor. Security barely glanced up as they waved her. Her name was already in the system. Someone had prepared for her. Elevator to floor 47, the executive suite. Her heart pounded harder with each floor rising. She wasn't just stepping into a building, she was stepping into the mouth of a lion. The door opened to a suite, quieter than any place she'd ever known. Warm wood panels, glass walls with views that swallowed the skyline, and at the far end behind a minimalist desk sat Julian Hawthorne. He didn't stand, he didn't smile, he didn't even speak at first. He simply studied her with eyes like frozen steel, eyes that had seen empires rise and crumble without blinking. "Alara Monroe," he said at last. "You're persistent, I'm desperate." She replied softly, tightening her grip on the file. "This house, it's not just property. It's my home, my memories, my family." Julian leaned back. "You understand how numbers work, Miss Monroe. You owe $324,000. That's not sentiment. That's liability." Tears threatened behind her eyes, but she held them back. "Please, there must be anything I can do." There was a pause, and then he slid a folder across the table. "A legal contract." Alara blinked. "What is this, a proposal?" Julian said. "A temporary legal arrangement. 1 year, you marry me. In name only. No emotional obligations, no physical relationship. After 1 year, the contract dissolves. You get the house. You get the medical coverage for your grandfather. No debts, no strings except one. You disappear when it's over." Ilara's heart stopped. "Why?" she asked. He stood then, crossing slowly to the window. "Because people expect me to settle down. I need someone who won't get in the way, who understands boundaries, who needs me as little as I need them." "And what do I get?" she whispered. "Peace, stability, and freedom from your past." Her voice cracked. "Isn't that the same as selling myself?" He turned his head slightly. "No, it's reclaiming yourself on my terms." The rain tapped gently against the window pane. Alara stared at the contract, cold and clean like hospital sheets. Every part of her soul screamed to walk away. But behind her mind's protests was the image of her grandfather, frail, confused, and slipping away, and the sound of her brother's laughter echoing through the old hallway. She walked out with the contract in her hand. That night, in her dark apartment, she lit a single candle and laid the contract on the table. Outside, the storm continued, but in her heart, another storm had begun, one that would test her strength, her identity, and her ability to love what seemed unlovable. And so began the story of Alara Monroe and Julian Hawthorne. Asterisk. The candle on Alara's kitchen table had burned down to a stub by the time morning light crept in through the curtains. She hadn't slept, not a minute. The contract lay in front of her like a silent dare-white paper, black ink, and the weight of impossible choices. She made tea she wouldn't drink. She watched the sky shift from grey to pale. She thought about her grandfather, how he had looked at her the night before, asking where her mother was. His memory flickered like a dying bulb now. Some days, stronger, others completely gone. How would he survive without the house he'd poured his life into? Without her? She turned her eyes to the contract again. It wasn't a fair deal. It wasn't even close to moral. But it was, in its own twisted way, a lifeline. Elara took a deep breath, picked up the pen, and signed her name. It didn't feel like an act of surrender. It felt like war. The wedding was private, cold, clinical, 2 signatures, a judge, a pair of rings that looked like they belonged to strangers. Julian Hawthorne didn't wear white. He wore a storm-colored suit and the same hollow expression he had the day they met. He said no vows, just handed her a new set of keys, a black credit card for approved necessities, and a folder with a schedule, appearances, events, a calendar that mapped out how their public life would look perfect, poised, untouchable. They didn't kiss, they didn't speak once the paperwork was done. And yet, when Elara walked out of the courthouse, married in name to one of the wealthiest, most untouchable men in the country, the air felt strangely lighter, not because she trusted him, but because, for the first time in months, she had a plan. She just didn't know it would cost her far more than she thought. Julian's penthouse was another world. It didn't have warmth, or life, or even the barest hint of who he was. It looked like a hotel room trapped in permanent winter glass, stone, and $1,000 couch that had probably never been sat on. Elara was given her own wing, a suite larger than her entire childhood home, complete with a library she could never finish and a view of the skyline that made her feel like a ghost floating above it all. She found comfort in the small things. A cozy chair tucked near the window, an old leather journal she unpacked and started writing in again, and the way the silence gave her room to breathe, at least at first. The rules were clear. Meals were separate, no entry into Julian's personal wing. Public appearances were too. Be prepared in advance. No interviews, no sociamagia, no deviation. It was, in every sense, a performance, and observant Elara was expected to become part of his set design. She played the part. She smiled when cameras flashed. At charity galas, she nodded politely to societal women who whispered behind crystal glasses. She stood by Julian's side, his hand occasionally brushing hers, as if by accident, and learned the art of being invisible in plain sight, but behind the curtain of elegance and money, something felt, unfinished. She began to watch him, quietly, closely. He was a man of patterns. He worked late into the night. He took no calls past midnight. He avoided personal questions like they were landmines. He kept his world small, controlled, sanitized. But then, just once she caught him alone on the rooftop at dawn, hands buried in his pockets, his jaw clenched against the chill. He didn't see her, or if he did, he didn't care. He stood there like a man waiting for a storm that never came. That image stayed with her. So did the question, what had frozen Julian Hawthorne's soul? Weeks passed. Her grandfather's health stabilized, thanks to the private nurse Julian had arranged. The house was saved. Her life, on paper, looked perfect, but Elara's heart remained restless, until one evening, everything shifted. She had returned from a solo trip to the bookstore, an errand Julian hadn't commented on, though he must have known. When she entered the apartment, something was off. The lights were dim, and the air was thick with a silence that didn't belong. She found him not in his study, but in the Gallery 1 room she had never dared to enter. It wasn't filled with art, as she expected. It was filled with photographs, dozens, hundreds, black and white images, framed and mounted with care. Some of people, some of streets, some of skies half-lit by fading sunsets. But what struck her most was the wall in the far corner. There, in stark contrast to the others, hung a single large frame, a young woman, dark hair, distant eyes, a subtle, melancholic smile. Elara didn't speak. She knew enough about grief to recognize its fingerprints. Julian didn't turn. She used to say, "I was made of stone," he said quietly, voice rougher than she'd ever heard, but she never knew. She was the only thing that kept me warm. Elara stepped closer, breath catching. "Your sister." A long pause. "My wife." A silence hung between them, too heavy to ignore, too sacred to fill with small talk. She died 5 years ago, he continued, his voice low. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late. We tried everything. I would have given every cent, every building, every breath. He broke off. I couldn't save her, he said, but I could make sure no one else could get close enough to hurt me. And just like that, a piece of the puzzle slid into place. Julian Hawthorne wasn't heartless, he was shattered. Alara looked at the photo again. She was beautiful, she was brave, he corrected. She saw through all of this through me. The vulnerability in his voice was like a crack in the armor he wore so well. And for the first time, Alara didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man still haunted by the weight of what he couldn't fix. That night, Alara couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid of what she'd seen, but because something had awakened inside hers, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose not to fix Julian, not to change him, but to be a light in the silence he'd chosen to live with heart, even in a home that had forgotten how to feel. And maybe, just maybe, remind a man made of ice that warmth wasn't a weakness, it was the beginning of hope. The morning sun crept through the tall windows of the penthouse, casting soft golden lines across the cold floors. Alara stood barefoot in the silence, staring at the wall of photographs that had haunted her sleep. The woman in the center, Julian's wife, had a gaze so piercing it stayed with her, even in dreams. It wasn't sadness or joy in those eyes, it was knowing, as if she understood things others never would. Alara hadn't spoken to Julian since that night, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some pain required space, and Julian wore his grief like armor not to protect himself, but to keep the world from reopening wounds he had stitched together with discipline and distance. Still, something had shifted. It wasn't just in him, it was in her. She had come into this arrangement thinking she was trading her name for security, but now, she wasn't sure what she was part of anymore. It wasn't love, it wasn't business, it was something stranger to live sharing space, but not breath. Two stories folding into each other. Even as their pages remained sealed, she began to notice the details. The way Julian left one coffee cup on the edge of the counter every morning, blacked untouched, a ritual with no purpose. The way he paused at the same window each night at 9:47, phone in hand, but never called anyone. The way he avoided mirrors, as though the reflection reminded him of a version of himself he couldn't face anymore. She stopped calling it his penthouse. She stopped thinking of him as untouchable. It was on a Wednesday that everything changed. Alara had just returned from visiting her grandfather, who had smiled that darily smiled for the first time in weeks. The nurse said he had been humming an old lullaby. That small sliver of joy stayed with her as she walked through the front door of the penthouse. But the apartment was dark, not dim dark, she called out. But no answer. Something in her chest tightened. She moved through the halls, quiet and fast. When she reached Julian's wing, a space she had never crossed into, her hesitation lasted only a moment. She opened the door. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Shadows spilled across the floor. She turned a corner and froze. Julian sat on the edge of his bed, back hunched, shirt untucked. He looked like he hadn't slept, not just last night, but in days. His hands were pressed over his eyes, his elbows on his knees. And then she saw the pill bottle at his feet. Panic sliced through her, but before she could speak, he looked up. His expression wasn't one of guilt or fear. It was exhaustion. "I didn't take them," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not today." She stepped inside, slowly, heart pounding in her chest. "Why would you even think about it?" He laughed bitterly. "You think grief is a staircase. You climb it once and you're done. Some nights I'm fine. Others, I walk right up to the edge, just to see if anything's changed." Her throat tightened. She had heard words like these from the mirror before. She sat beside him, close but not touching. "What made you stop tonight?" He turned his head toward her. A silence followed that neither of them dared break. "It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was human. Your presence is quieter than hers," he said, "but it doesn't disappear. And somehow, that matters." It was the first time he'd let her see him, not the man in suits, not the CEO, but the grieving, broken soul beneath it all. She didn't give him answers. She didn't quote cliches instead. She stood and went to the kitchen, made tea, brought it back. They sat there on the floor, a foot apart, sipping in silence. It became a pattern. Every few nights he'd speak, not much, but enough. Stories about his childhood, about the places he once dreamed of visiting but never did. about a dog he had as a boy that he still remembered by name. Ilara never pried, but when she listened, she did it with her whole heart. And something about that made Julian begin to change. He started eating meals with her, not every day, but often enough. He asked about her drawings, her childhood, her dreams. One afternoon, she found a new tablet on her desktop of the line, "No note attached." He never mentioned it, but when she looked up from across the room, he just gave a small nod. It was that same evening she began sketching again, not just for work, but for herself. She sketched the view from the penthouse, the outline of Julian's hands when he wasn't looking, even the cracks in the marble floor symbolic somehow of beauty within imperfection. And then one day, she drew the woman from the photograph, not copied, reimagined, smiling wider, healthier, alive. Julian saw it by accident, and his eyes burned. "I forgot what she looked like when she was happy," he whispered. "You brought her back." Ilara didn't know what to say. She only knew something was happening. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably, it was no longer about the contract or the debt. She wasn't just in his home anymore. She was in his story, and though they hadn't spoken, the words both knew they were walking the edge of something fragile and real. But life, like grief, never moves in straight lines, and just when they began to trust the silence between them, the past came knocking with claws. The next chapter would demand more courage than either of them had ever known. And it would begin with a single phone call, one that would test everything they were becoming. The phone rang at exactly 6:02 a.m. The sound shattered the early morning stillness like a stone through glass dot. Julian wasn't in the kitchen, where he usually brooded over untouched coffee. Ilara, still wrapped in her robe, picked up the receiver without thinking, expecting the nurse or a business call she could quietly ignore. But the voice on the other end wasn't familiar. "Ilara Morgan," a woman asked, her tone sharp, clipped, almost metallic. "Yes, who is this?" There was a brief pause. Then, with a precision that made her breath catch, the voice said, "You don't know me, but you should. I was Julian's wife's sister." Silence. Ilara froze. "I need to talk to you. In person. Today." Ilara swallowed, pulse racing. "Why? What is this about?" But the line went dead. An hour later, she was seated in a quiet cafe downtown. It was drizzling outside. Of course it was. Seattle rain always knew when to arrive, like punctuation in a heavy chapter. The woman arrived 15 minutes late. She wore dark sunglasses, though the sun hadn't shown itself in days, and a coat that looked expensive, but was wrinkled at the sleeves. Her posture screamed control, but her eyes, once the glasses came off, held something else entirely. "You're not what I expected," she said as she sat down. "I get that a lot." Ilara replied calmly. The woman gave a tight smile. "My name is Cassandra Vale. My sister's name was Mariana." Ilara had seen her Mariana in the photograph. Gentle eyes, a weary smile. "I won't pretend I'm not surprised you married Julian," Cassandra continued, pulling out a folder from her bag and laying it on the table. "But I don't believe in coincidence. Not when it comes to him." Ilara felt the world tilt slightly. "I don't understand." "You wouldn't. He's careful with what he shows, controlled, brilliant, cold when he needs to be." Cassandra's eyes narrowed. "But I also know this. He doesn't let anyone into his orbit unless there's a reason. So the question isn't, why did you marry him? The question is, why did he choose you?" Ilara blinked. "It wasn't like that. It was circumstantial." Cassandra leaned forward. "That's what I thought too, until I found this." She slid the folder across the table. Ilara opened it. Her hands went numb. It was filled with surveillance photos of her dot outside her cafe, walking with her grandfather, sketching on park benches. Months before she ever met Julian. Ilara looked up, heart pounding. "What is this?"
"I
don't know," Cassandra said, "but it means one thing. You were never a stranger to him." Ilara felt her world unravel at the edges. She thought back how easily the contract was arranged, how smoothly the debt was handled, how quickly she was pulled into his world. Had it all been orchestrated? She returned to the penthouse like someone moving through a dream. Every wall felt closer, every echo louder. Julian was in his study. When she entered, he looked up from his laptop, eyes calm as ever. But when he saw her face, his expression shifted. "What happened?" She walked in slowly, laid the folder down on his desk. "You tell me." He stared at the photos. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he leaned back, rubbed his temples, and sighed. "I didn't lie to you," he said. But I didn't tell you everything either. Ilara crossed her arms. Start telling. He looked at her, and for the first time since they met, his mask cracked not with anger or arrogance, but something almost like regret. I knew your father, he said quietly, briefly. We crossed paths in a project long ago before the accident. He had big dreams, but little support. He was working on something, a design that could have changed things for both our industries. Ilara's breath caught. My father was an engineer. He never talked about that. He was also desperate. Julian continued. He tried to get backing, but no one would listen. I saw something in him, something familiar. I offered to help, but then he disappeared months before the crash. I thought he gave up. But then, years later, your name came across my desk, attached to a foreclosure case. I looked into it. Ilara stepped back. So you spied on me? No, he said firmly. I watched over you. She stared at him in disbelief. I saw a girl working 3 jobs, taking care of a fading man, sketching beauty in a world that gave her none. I didn't plan to meet you, but when the foreclosure hit, I couldn't look away anymore. I didn't know how to help you without breaking you. His voice softened. So I made a plan. Not perfect, not right, but the only one I knew. Ilara's throat tightened. And the contract, the marriage. His eyes met hers. I thought if I gave you a way out, you'd take it, and you did. But I never expected. He paused. I never expected you to matter. The room pulsed with silence. Ilara's heart ached with confusion. Was this betrayal or salvation? I don't know what to believe, she whispered. Julian stood, walked toward her. His voice dropped. Believe what you've seen in me. Not the man they talk about. Not the man who built glass towers. Believe the man who sat on the floor and drank tea with you in silence. That's who I am when you're in the room. She looked up, tears gathering but not falling. I want to believe you, Julian. I do. But I don't know if I can trust a heart that builds walls before bridges. He didn't touch her. He just said, then let me earn it. Not with money, not with gifts, but with truth. Ilara turned away. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. Truth, when it finally arrived, never came clean. It came with bruises, and the next truth waiting for her would change everything. Because, in the shadows of her past, a letter lay unopened, a letter her father had, written days before the accident, and it was about Julian. The letter arrived in a weathered envelope, edges curled like a memory trying to protect itself from time. Ilara found it buried in a faded box in her grandfather's attic, beneath old photo albums and yellowed newspaper clippings. She hadn't meant to go looking, wasn't even sure what she was looking for. But after the confrontation with Julian, after Cassandra's cold warning, and after hearing truths that felt half-formed, she needed answers. Not from Julian, not from Cassandra, but from the one man who had started it all, her father. She sat alone on the attic floor, breath shallow as she unfolded the page. His handwriting was hurried, but familiar. Every loop of ink carried a ghost of his voice. My dearest Lena, if you're reading this, then something went wrong. I hope it didn't, but I've made too many mistakes not to prepare for the worst. This isn't a goodbye letter. It's a truth you were never meant to carry, but I trust you'll be stronger than I was. There's a man named Julian Hart. If you ever cross paths with him, I want you to know this. I believed in him once, more than I believed in myself. He was the only person who ever saw my work, not just the diagrams, but the vision. And he offered to help, not for profit, but because he saw potential where others saw failure. But I backed out. I got scared. I thought he'd leave me behind, take credit, build an empire from my idea. So I ran. I hid the designs. I mocked the house, trying to fund it alone. That was the choice that ruined us. If he's still out there, and if you ever meet him, don't look at him through my fear. Look at him through your own eyes. Ilara sat frozen, her fingers trembling. The letter didn't accuse, it confessed. Her father hadn't been betrayed. He'd been afraid of being forgotten, of being left behind, of trusting someone enough to share the dream. For the first time, the pieces began to shift. Julian hadn't stalked her. He hadn't plotted to own her life. He had watched from a distance, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of duty, but also possibly unthinkably out of care. She held the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. A quiet war waged inside her. She had built so many walls after her parents' deaths, walls of survival, of silence, of suspicion. And Julian, he had built walls too, not just around his heart, but around his past. Maybe the only way forward was to tear them down together. That night, the penthouse was unusually still. Julian sat on the terrace, overlooking the city he had shaped with steel and silence. Alara walked out to him without saying a word and handed him the letter. He read it in full, didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself. When he finished, he folded the paper gently and looked at her not as a man caught, but as one finally seen. I never wanted to take from him, he said quietly. Your father was brilliant, but also proud. He couldn't believe someone might want to help without strings attached. He thought I'd steal his vision. I just wanted to bring it to life. And she asked softly. I needed to know you were okay, he said. It wasn't obsession, it was obligation. I owed him that. And when I saw the way you fought to stay afloat, I saw him again, but stronger, fiercer. Alara leaned on the railing beside him. The wind carried the scent of rain and something sweeter, maybe jasmine, maybe the beginning of change. You should have told me, she whispered. I know, he said. They stood in silence, not awkward, not tense, just silent, like two travelers resting at the edge of a long road, uncertain whether to turn back or move forward. Julian spoke again, his voice raw. I didn't ask you to marry me because of guilt. I asked because I believed we could save each other without pretending we weren't broken. Alara turned to face him, then stop hiding the cracks. Let me see all of them. He nodded, and in that moment, something melted between them, not into love. Not yet, but into something more dangerous and rare, trust trying to be born. Over the next few days, change unfolded in quiet ways. Julian gave her space in his company, not as a charity, but as a collaborator. He asked for her thoughts on design, innovation, even branding. She was no business expert, but he listened like her opinions mattered. She started illustrating again, not just cityscapes, but people. Julian, her grandfather, her younger self, smiling in a way she never remembered doing, and for the first time, she submitted one of her personal pieces to an international art show under her full name, Alara Morgan Hart. But progress never walks in a straight line, because 3 days after the letter, Cassandra returned, and this time, she didn't come alone. She brought lawyers along her. She said, eyes colder than the rain, we need to talk, not as family, but as witnesses. Julian stepped forward, but Cassandra blocked him with her words. There's more about Mariana you don't know, about how she died, about why she stayed with you, Julian, even when you stopped being a husband and started becoming a ghost. Alara stepped between them. Say what you came to say, she told Cassandra, and Cassandra did. Words like medical reports, disappearances, inheritance claims, buried files spilled out like poison. None of it was proven, but all of it was possible. Julian didn't defend himself. He stood like a man who'd seen this storm before. That night, Alara sat alone again, letter in hand, heart at war. Could two people outrun the shadows of their past? Could the truth heal, or only hurt? And was love still possible when trust had to be earned from the ashes? There were no answers yet, but one thing was certain. The final test was coming, and this time, she would not be a quiet passenger in someone else's story. She would be the one writing it. The storm came not with thunder, but with silence. Alara woke to an empty side of the bed. Julian sighed. The sheets were still slightly warm, a ghost of his presence lingering like the scent of his cologne. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, but in the penthouse, everything stood still, as if waiting for the last note in a symphony that had taken too long to end. A folded note rested on her nightstand, neatly written, not like the cold legal pages Julian once handed her. This was personal. Real Alara, if you're reading this, I've left not to run but to finally face what I should have long ago. There are things Cassandra said that were true, things I ignored, buried, feared. I loved Mariana once, and I failed her. I don't know if what happened to her was entirely my fault, but I know I wasn't there the way a man should be. I've always thought protecting people meant hiding the darkness, but with you, I've learned something different. That courage means standing in the light, even if the truth hurts. I'll be back, not for closure, but for clarity. You deserve that. Julian Alara stared at the note until her vision blurred. He hadn't left her. He was choosing to fight for himself, for the truth, for her, but she couldn't sit still. Not anymore. Not like she had when her parents died. Not like she had when the house went into foreclosure. Not like she had when Julian first handed her a contract disguised as a lifeline. No, this time. She would walk through the fire with her eyes open. She started with Mariana. Ilara visited the last address. Cassandra had mentioned a hospice center tucked away in the outskirts of the city. The receptionist was hesitant until Ilara showed her the wedding ring and Julian's name. Then the records opened. Slowly, grudgingly, Mariana had stayed there. In the final weeks of her illness, cancer, aggressive, quiet, she had signed herself in under a false name, Margaret Vale. Cassandra had known, but never told Julian. Their marriage had already unraveled by then. Silence had grown so thick between them. Mariana had decided to die alone rather than reach out to the man who had once loved her.